Good morning. Good morning, all. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. Good morning. My name is Mackenzie Eaglen. I'm a defense analyst here at AEI. I look at numbers and budgets and lots of other things in the military policy space. And I'm so pleased to have all of you here to join us, even on a 2-hour delay, or for actually not for the government, but for all of our kids, right? Let's be honest. That's the world we live in, the reality. And reaching over rocky snowdrifts this morning. So anyway, thanks for making it in. We welcome our online live viewing audience as well. I'm not going to give you long intros to our panelists because you're probably here because you know who they are already. I'll just briefly go down the line and welcome immediately to my left my colleague, my good friend, my long-standing friend, my neighbor here at Brookings, Michael O'Hanlon, 2 doors down. Dr. O'Hanlon is a master of many things, but the defense budget, of course, is first among them, but a foreign policy mind, a brilliant author, publisher of many books, things I've not done in life yet. # life goals. Steve Kosiak is second to my left, to your right. And Steve joins us from also a very a long practitioner past. I knew Steve back in his think tank days over at CSBA, but also really his OMB hat and his brilliance of having worked at the Office of Management and Budget in the past is one of the reasons we were so happy he agreed to join us this morning. He now works at Ingley, Sauer, Mosley. Is it Kosiak too? I don't know the exact name.
Partner. Yeah.
Partner, okay, at running a consulting firm, telling people smart things, particularly when skinny budgets come out like tomorrow. So thanks, Steve, for being here. And lastly is my also very good friend and colleague, Roger Zakheim. Roger's a visiting fellow here at AEI in our defense team. We're lucky to have him. But he makes his waves and pleases Washington at Covington & Burling Law Firm, where he spends most of his free time. And Roger, of course, came over as number 2 on the House Armed Services Committee, where we work together very, very closely, among many other things that he also has done. So welcome to the panel. Thanks for being here. We're here to talk about the defense budget, but specifically one part of the defense budget that's not the base spending budget, right? The annual amount that sort of keeps the trains running, so to speak, on time, but frankly, the emergency spending account. OCO, as you guys already know, stands for Overseas Contingency Operations. It's a loose term, meaning what this account actually funds. But what's the point? The point of OCO, or the war spending account, or the emergency money in defense, this is not something new. This is something we've done historically whenever there have been wars or conflicts. What is new about OCO, I believe, is the longevity with which we use it, and now the sort of blatant misuse of this account, right? Because we have these handcuffs known as the Budget Control Act, which limit how much the Pentagon can request each year, barring tweaking or amendment by Congress like Ryan Murray or budget deals, how much can be put into that account. And so this spending pot is unique in terms of what it's used for, and frankly, the most important thing, how it's paid for. So there's often confusion in Washington about, because it's for, Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or even Russia, European Assurance Initiative kind of stuff. The key thing that you have to remember is how we pay for the OCO. We don't pay for it. It goes on the credit card. It's debt financed, essentially. Because it's above the caps, it's not paid for with taxpayer dollars that essentially come in and then are doled back out by Congress in the discretionary account. So we put it on the credit card, we pay for it later, it's off the books, and that is why it doesn't count against the caps. So quick OCO summary. I probably just stole the thunder of Michael O'Hanlon, who I was going to basically ask for just a quick summary here. A brief scene setter. Good morning, to get everybody started. I just told you what I think the OCO account, the budget, the conflict contingency budget is intended for. Did I miss anything, and how do you see that, Michael?
Thanks, Mackenzie. Good morning, everybody. It's nice to be up here with my fellow Georgian as we were talking about our need for solidarity after a rough Super Bowl and in general in these times in Washington.
Yes.
I think the main points, the main thing I want to start by saying, you brilliantly laid out the nature of the OCO account today, the problems with using it the way we have, in the sense of now probably 20 to 25 billion a year out of the 60 is not even really emergency use. However, since it's March 15th, since my name's O'Hanlon, I'll say that just like with an Irishman on St. Patrick's Day who will take his beer where he can get it, or my kids this winter who will take their snow days when they can get them, I will take OCO over the plausible alternatives. And in fact, I would say that especially now with the Trump administration looking to make what I would say a very reasonable $54 billion increase in the annual defense budget, at least relative to the sequestration level, as you underscored when this was first being discussed in your very good blog. That's a modest amount of money, especially compared to what Mr. Trump would like to do with the Pentagon. And so, if anything, I have no problem with his $54 billion proposed increase in defense. It's about what I was arguing for in my little booklet last year, the $650 billion bargain, the case for modest growth in America's defense budget. I have a problem with how we're paying for it, because I don't see domestic or other international accounts having the kind of surplus funds that can generate that $54 billion. So I'd rather, as much as using OCO this way is sort of a little bit of a sin, I'd rather see us sin a little more in this relatively less egregious way, rather than do what I think is the credible alternative at this moment in Washington, which is to cut even more into some of the non-DoD accounts if we were going to eliminate OCO misuse and properly channel things through the correct budget, the base budget. That would imply that we're going to have to cut even more from domestic accounts and non-defense international accounts in order to fund that, given the basic framework in which Director Mulvaney and others seem to be operating. So, granted, Congress may not go with that approach, may not support the president's proposed budget, but I guess what I'm saying in summary is that as bad as the current system is, I can imagine a lot worse things in the short term, and I think we might just get worse things in the short term. So, in fact, I'd rather double down on our misdeeds for the short term and see that $54 billion increase generated primarily by essentially either a modification to the Budget Control Act if we could get it, but if not, a little more misuse of OCO rather than see the Coast Guard and security assistance and the State Department, not to mention a lot of domestic accounts that I think are important for our long-term national economic strength and national power, be savaged.
Great point. So let me just clarify. So Michael is talking about President Trump's proposed, leaked, but highly accurate, which we'll see tomorrow, confirmed, $54 billion proposed increase to the defense budget for fiscal year 2018. My understanding is, and we'll get to Steve on this next, is that that's going to be to the base budget, right? So they're going to be proposing to open the books on Budget Control Act and amend it if they can. And I agree with you, that's a big, capital I, capital F, if they can. I presume President Trump, I'm certain, will also come in with an OCO amount above that. I don't think we'll get those details tomorrow. I think we'll get those details in May in terms of what is his FY18 emergency spending account number. So President Obama came in with a slightly lower number this year in the high 50s, modified his Afghanistan strategy slightly and troop levels, and then requested a little bit more. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, Chairman McCain and Thornberry were pushing the administration to increase this account by $18 billion, actually, for equipment and weapons and other priorities, readiness included. Anyway, long story short, they're going to come out at roughly 69 billion in OCO this year. You talked about at least 20 to 25. I think Bob Work, the current Deputy Secretary, would say it's 30 to 34, depending on who's calculating it, the Hill or DoD, is predictable, regular base budget spending priorities in that. So what I'm going to come back and ask you so you can think about it now in our Q&A is, what if Mr. Trump's $54 billion base budget increase includes some of this migration and they call that increase? Because I think that's just moving money around. I hope not. So Steve, can you talk briefly about the history of this account? Not necessarily before 2001, although we would welcome that as well, and other wars like Vietnam, but really how this account has been used. I don't think we've seen 50% of it for base budget priorities until now at any point since 2001, although we have seen OMB over the years widen and restrict the aperture for what's allowable under OCO. Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think the OCO account is basically, it's an account. It's basically designed to cover temporary and extraordinary costs that are related to military operations, and that's the notion behind it. It really dates from the 1990 91, first Gulf War. I mean, that's when we first used it. We did have caps back then. So that, it's supposed to segregate funding. So, and I think basically three purposes. One, so we have transparency, like we do in other parts of the budget. We know where the money is going. It's going to military operations and not going to modernization or whatever. Just as like we know what other accounts are going for in the Pentagon's budget. It's also used, the notion was also to ensure that we're not raiding the base defense budget to pay for temporary military operations, and at the same time ensure that we're, once those conflicts draw down, we're not pumping that money into the base budget for purposes it wasn't intended for. So that's the logic of it. I think it's worked. You could kind of grade it by, in terms of those three different criteria and come up with, I think, different answers about how effective it's been. I think it's done a good job of making sure we don't raid the base defense budget for DoD. I think it's done a mixed job sort of in terms of transparency because we're at a point now where, as Mackenzie said, we have something like 50% of the budget, the OCO budget, for base activities. And in terms of budget discipline, I think it's had a mixed record as well since we've had this, this sort of migration of base activities being funded into OCO. Although I will say the extent of that to date has not, we're talking, well, at least from my tenure at OMB, going from basically the 2010 budget to the last few years, the migration into the base budgets, of base activities into the OCO budget's probably been on the order of, I would say probably in the order of $10 to $15 billion, maybe on that order, which is about 2 to 3% of the base budget. So it's not. I think it's had some meaningful. It's been meaningfully disciplining as well. It hasn't been to the extent it's been misused. It's still had some meaningful impact, I think. In terms of the fluctuations of how it's funded, I think the first major increase, sort of expansion of OCO, came in 2007 when the DoD basically opened the spigots a little bit and said you can fund not just stuff related to military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also stuff that's useful for the broader global war on terrorism, which meant a lot of things. It was sort of like saying stuff that was good during the Cold War. If you'd said you can use Vietnam War funding for stuff that is related to the Cold War. So it was, it did open the spigots. And I don't want to overstate it, but it did open the spigots significantly. And then it was tamped down, I think, a little bit. As Mackenzie said, it's sort of been up and down here at the start of the Obama administration. But then with the caps, pressure grew to provide some flexibility to DoD. Some money was added. For example, at one point we added additional funding for temporary end strength that had initially been funded because it hadn't been considered temporary. It was going to be permanent end strength. But once we decided it's going to be temporary end strength as we're drawing down our forces, we sort of changed the rules and let that be funded through OCO. And there were some other areas like that where we allowed a little additional funding for DoD for what had been base activities into OCO. Then we had the BBA in 2015, which kind of explicitly added about $5 billion, what turned out to be about $5 billion for base activities in OCO. And then I would say the other change that has happened has had less to do with changing the rules than sort of changing sort of how to interpret those rules or sort of the logic of those rules. And let me give you an example. I think back in 2001, or in the early days of the post 9/11, and even in the early days of the Obama administration, it still appeared that some of these costs were actually temporary and extraordinary. And I think at this point, it's clear that some of those costs aren't temporary and extraordinary. So it's not really a misuse of OCO in that sense, but it's just a new realization that these are now kind of base activities, and there's a part of that $25 to $30 billion that is due to that as well. So I don't know if that gives you a flavor for how it has the history.
Thank you. You referenced BBA, and so I want Roger to walk us through a little bit to explain to the audience, remind everybody what's happened since the Budget Control Act took effect. We had the fiscal cliff, and then we've had two mini deals, I think both called BBA actually. And if you could walk us through kind of Congress's role in OCO and all the way up to the McCain-Thornberry push this year.
Well, thanks, Mackenzie. Great to be here. Happy to talk about the congressional role. And I think Steve did a good job of explaining how OCO has been used and the rules have kind of evolved or devolved depending on your perspective. But the major factor that I think that has really altered the way OCO is looked at is the Budget Control Act. right? And it's this kind of Congress speaking out of both sides of their mouth, right? You have the Freedom Caucus and the budget hawks or fiscal hawks that have said, thou shalt not spend more than $1.1 trillion in total discretionary savings, or spending, excuse me, and we're not going to allow any budget or appropriation to go through that exceeds that, and then managing the reality of that we have wars, and we have things that are coming close to war. We're spending like it's a war, even though we're not calling them a war. How the heck are we going to pay for that? So we'll go ahead and just do it off budget on the OCO. And so on one hand, we could tell the fiscal hawks that we modified, we've put a cap on overall discretionary spending, at the same time taking care of the business of fighting the wars. And then with each deal that you've described, which essentially was a series of events where Republicans were threatening to shut down government, in some cases got right up to the, did it, and then right to the edge, we had to come up with some sort of framework to deal with it, and that's how you get with the kind of more pressure on the OCO. I just want to step back with a broader point, which kind of was descriptive of what was happening during the Obama administration, and seems to be what will continue to happen in the Trump administration, which is that the Budget Control Act, and Mackenzie and Mike and others have written about this a lot, was a reflection of the failure of the super committee, right? Particularly sequestration. This inability to say, we're going to do something about the major drivers of our debt, namely, Social Security and Medicare and the entitlement spending, which continues to consume, as many of you in the room know, a larger portion of our budget with every passing year. And so the inability for the super committee to do anything on these major drivers of the debt resulted in the Congress, essentially for the years that followed, to play what I call small ball, right? We're just going to go ahead and have major fights and threaten to shut down our government as a result of, 10, 50, $60 billion, pick your number. And we're going to get really animated and upset about it, and we're just going to lock the whole thing up. For what? For something that really did nothing to have any major dramatic change in how we spend. I think the hope was, with the new administration, new government, you have Republican majorities in the House and Senate, of course, Republican in the White House, that somehow we would depart from that. And I'll go back to what Mike was talking about, and this is really, this can be interesting to see the way the Congress plays into it, but with someone like OMB Director Mulvaney coming in, putting forward a budget that, where the Congress doesn't seem set to do anything related to entitlement reform. It's focusing on tax reform, which, oh, by the way, would probably result in more spending, not less spending, because they can't pay for it. We'd probably be less reform, more cuts, is that we're back to small ball. Yep. And that, I think, is the major reality we have to contend with, and explains why Michael Hanlon says, okay, it's a modest, growth in defense budget. It's something that you probably would have seen the trajectory of Barack Obama's budget. It's 3% more, but with what's happening with the Fed today, it really essentially is a flat line. And as a result, nothing has changed fundamentally with respect to how we are addressing the drivers of our debt and how we're going to deal with defense spending, which comes back to the OCO. And I think this explains why Mike's using the beer analogy in St. Patrick's Day, which is, listen, we have to have a serious conversation about OCO. Mackenzie and I have been talking about this for a long time. We thought we might be in an environment where we can allow that to happen, when we're going to do a military rebuild and we can shift priorities that we're taking care of in the OCO and bring them back to the base. But that's not going to happen if we're still in a Budget Control Act environment, which, even with this $54 billion increase, given the priorities that we have to take care of, hopefully we'll get to the way the world's changed between 2001 and now, and the number of priorities we have to address. We can't deal with these structural challenges. We're just you're not given the flexibility. We're not dealing with the problems, the hard problems, and as a result, we can't make fundamental change.
It's horrifying, actually, to put it mildly, because what I see then coming over tomorrow in this skinny budget, which is really going to be a policy document. This isn't going to be a big number crunching kind of thing that we would all enjoy. President Trump's proposed first budget is going to please no one. So to your point, Roger, it's not going to please the fiscal hawks because it's really the status quo. And it's not going to please defense hawks because they're going to see it as a flat line year over year, particularly when we add in the OCO, which we don't know, and we get enacted versus enacted. This is really, it's either at best an inflation-adjusted defense budget, could possibly be negative real growth, which I think would shock the president who wants to do different things with that money. And I got news for him. He's not going to be able to do that. So, and plus, they're going to propose the way to pay for this defense growth, as Michael alluded to, was something that cannot pass Capitol Hill. So it's a non-starter. So all of these budget fights are we're throwing fuel on the same old fights of the last administration and the last Congress when it was.
But with one addition, which I think is quite relevant to the commander-in-chief, which is, and why I think in some respects this budget does the president a disservice, is that the president has called for, and you note in your article in the National Interest, a rebuild of the military. And I think if you ask the Secretary of Defense, he would say that this allows me to kind of triage, right? And put Band-Aids on some of the cuts, literally. But it is not going to allow me, the Secretary of Defense, to provide the President of the United States with the rebuild he has called for. And it seems to me the President is someone who wants to be able to tout, either in Twitter tweets or some other venue, that he is actually delivering on his campaign promises. And no one can make an argument, or invite anybody to try to make the argument, that the $603 billion number is actually going to deliver a rebuild.
I agree. So Steve and Mike, let me ask you two questions, and then just jump in to Roger's comments anyway. Steve, the first year of every new administration, first year, OMB tends to reevaluate the rules for OCO. What's allowable, what's not? Are we going to restrict it further? Are we going to broaden the aperture? Are we going to tighten the noose, so to speak? And Mr. Mulvaney, as a member of Congress before he was OMB chief for the last several years, has made this account in particular his laser-like focus in Congress. It's a slush fund. He sees it as what we've already identified it as up here on this panel. So what do we expect him to do? And if he migrates if he begins the migration process, and by that I mean of the proposed $54 billion base budget increase that President Trump will propose, let's say $10 billion of that is money that would have been in last year's emergency account, Michael. So then it's really a $44 billion increase, or am I misreading that? I'm just see that as an accounting trick, and so now you've really, again, further upset everybody.
Well, let me just make a couple comments on, and partly responding to Roger's comments, which I largely agree with, but I think I differ on a few things. One is, I think and I agree, let's step back a little bit. I think one thing we should look at a little bit is OCO and the caps are part of a budget process that we've had in place that's been painful for the last, since 2011, but certainly after 2011. It has yielded substantial deficit reduction. I mean, the overall process, including the tax increases that were provided, the deficit reduction due to the, even prior to the caps, the deficit reduction due to the sequestration caps, it's led to something on the order of $4 trillion in deficit reduction. It's part of the reason today we're thinking about adding money to different stuff. So I think and I'm not saying, whether or not DOD paid an inordinate share of those costs or whatever, one could debate that. But I mean, absent everything we did the last 6 years, we wouldn't be having this discussion about how much should we be adding. So I mean, I think that's to defense. So I mean, I think that's important to bear in mind. Another just sort of comment is, I think I totally agree that we haven't addressed what Simpson-Bowles, the super committee, talked about, was addressing, not focusing just on the discretionary portion of the budget, either the domestic part or the defense part, which is only about a third of spending, but the other part, mandatory spending. But the other half of what they talked about was tax increases, right? So it's not just that we haven't talked about Social Security and Medicare, for example. We haven't talked about tax increases, and in fact, this administration is going to be pushing huge tax cuts, which to me isn't helpful. If you're looking at the long-term
right now they're talking
sustainability.
Reform.
Right. They're talking about right.
You're probably right.
And I think and if you look at the history of it, and you look at the Bush administration, we had dramatic increases in the deficit during that period, largely due to unpaid for tax cuts. So I totally agree that we need to address that. I think Simpson-Bowles was tax increases. Minimum, let's not cut taxes, but I think what we're going to do is cut taxes. So I think for the long-term sustainability of defense and other areas of spending, that's not good news. So I guess that would be, if that's a second or third observation, I don't know. But also, I don't know that, I haven't seen the, I think we'll know better tomorrow, because we will get an FY17 budget amendment that will include additional money for OCO, so we'll get a better sense for what they're using OCO for. As Mackenzie said, I don't think we'll see the full 2018 OCO request. I think there'll be a placeholder in there. We'll see that back in May when the full details of the budget are released. But I wouldn't assume, I wouldn't assume that there's going to be any meaningful shift of base funding out of OCO and into the base budget. I wouldn't assume that any of the $54 billion is actually being stuff that over the past few years have been funding through OCO. I'm not saying it won't be, but I don't have that assumption. And if it's a $54 billion increase and there is no change in accounting rules for OCO, then this is a 10% increase, which is pretty dramatic, actually. I mean, I'm not, and for a 1-year increase, that's a big increase. I mean, that is a big increase, and we're only going to get 18 figures here. We're not going to get 19 figures or 20 figures, and we won't know those until at a minimum until May when they provide them, and we may not know them until we actually have an FY19 request a year from now, because often what happens is, because it's good for showing fiscal discipline, you show relatively flat budgets in the out years, and when the year comes, both on the domestic side and the non-defense side, you actually ask for increases. So I think it's too early to say where we are, whether this is an adequate buildup or an inadequate buildup, or what kind of buildup it will be. We have to wait until we get some additional information. So I'm pretty sure I didn't answer the one question you asked me to answer, but
No, you did. Michael, is 10% substantial?
Well, I want to take a step back like Roger did a minute ago, and I know a lot of people in this room know the numbers and follow the numbers very carefully, but I also want to take a step back and try to keep, as you've been doing as moderator, explaining them and putting them in broader context, because Steve talks about it as 10%, and that's a viable interpretation. That's not my interpretation. I don't think it's 10%, because it's 10% relative to the sequestration level, which actually only kicked in once in 2013. Every other time since then, we found some Band-Aid solution, and it's always been ugly, and people like Steve had to work their tail off, and Roger to make it happen in the real world and get DOD through. But relative
I didn't
to...
do anything about it. I just screamed.
Well, screaming, that was important too.
Screaming's good.
Yeah, we give you credit for that. But relative to sort of the typical number we were at through the Obama years, and relative to Obama's own plan, and taking into account the uncertainties over what might migrate and what might not, I think of it as more or less probably about a 3% increase. And as you point out, it may be less than that, maybe more than that, but let's just say it's about 3%. Okay, so that's 3% relative to a number for overall 050, national defense spending, which includes nuclear weapons and the Department of Energy, includes war costs. So $600 billion is the number I like to talk about. That's about where we are now. I think we should go up to, by the end of the Trump presidency, towards 650. I'm sort of a hawkish dove in the debate. So that's actually where Trump is. He wants to say he's going to have the biggest buildup, since Ronald Reagan, but he's basically equivalent to a Brookings scholar in terms of where he actually is.
That's a first. I have not heard that one yet. Wow, took that one out. That's interesting.
So this amount of growth is, to me, about right, but I say that as a hawkish dove, self-described nickname. And so I don't see it as a 10% increase. I don't really see it as a $54 billion increase either. And I would take note of the fact that if it winds up being roughly 3% real growth relative to an Obama base or to the recent past, then that is in comparison with, on average, Trump's earlier proposals, not yet reflected in official policy, but his earlier campaign promises to grow the force structure by roughly 10 to 15%. And we had good debates, the four of us, or some various permutations of the four of us last year, over whether 10 to 15% was enough and whether this was a correct response. But I think I saw that as probably a little more than we needed. Roger probably saw it as about right. I'll let him speak for himself in a second. My main point is it's 10 to 15% that we're trying to fund with a 3% increase in the base budget. Now you could say, well, adding combat force structure can be done. It doesn't have to imply, even if you do 10 to 15% growth in combat force structure, doesn't have to mean a 10% or 15% increase in the overall budget, because some of your infrastructure doesn't need to grow. But the very rough rule of thumb that I use, that I've tried to understand over the years, is that you do have to spend about 2/3 as much, at least, in your overall budget. So in other words, if we're getting a 10 to 15% growth in force structure, we need to get at least 2/3 of that in the overall base budget. So we need a 7 to 12% increase in base budget to afford the Trump force structure as previously articulated. In other words, the money's not there. If you literally combine the proposed $54 billion with the proposed increase in force structure, you make the mismatch worse, as this one explained so well in her blog about a month ago, and that's where my math comes out as well. So you can like or not like the 10 to 15% force structure, say that's enough or not enough. That's that's a broader policy debate about strategy and operations and so forth. But I think in budgetary terms, at the moment, the Trump plans don't connect. His desire to substantially, well, modestly increase the force structure. It's not, historically, it's not a huge increase relative to where we've been in the Cold War, certainly. We'd still be way below Cold War levels. We'd sort of get back to Clinton levels in terms of force structure and size with this 10 to 15% proposed growth in force structure. If we do that, we're not going to have enough money in what's currently being offered.
And Roger, I know you're leaping to jump in. Quickly, also, as you do, think about this question. Senator McCain and Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Thornberry, the two chairmen of the authorizing committees for defense, they're proposing a $640 billion base defense budget. Put aside the OCO, the war, the emergency money, and talk about Michael's last point and anything else you were going to say.
Yeah, so I think it's great to have people like Michael Hanlon do what they do, because he might have his view as far as what's required, $650 billion by a certain point in time, but what you just heard Michael do was say, okay, I'm going to hold President Trump's proposal and put it against his budget. And as an analyst, are you going to get there? And I heard the answer was no. That's probably the most important takeaway from the budget standpoint, and I agree with Michael on that. I want to respond to what something Steve said before, and he made a correct point that over the past, since the Budget Control Act, the federal government has realized some deficit reduction. And that's clearly the case. That deficit reduction, though, came on the backs of discretionary spending, most notably reduction in defense spending, or at least planned growth. And that's an important point, because it explains what we're trying to do with the defense budget now, right? This anywhere between 3 and 10% growth is not going to achieve anything new for the military. It's actually trying to dig out of the hole we dug for ourselves as a result of the Budget Control Act and sequestration that followed, right? And that matters because we're not just talking about numbers and percentages here. And this gets to your point, Mackenzie, about $640 billion what McCain and Thornberry want. Because there's actually an international security environment that's animating this discussion, okay? And if you look at the framework by which we actually built out, the budgets back in 2011, so-called Gates budget, or beforehand, it was dealing in a world that, for the most part, was animated by the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, more broadly, the war on terrorism, okay? There was recognition that, China was out there and we'd have to do something on modernization down the road, right? And that was a challenge. There was no discussion of Russia and security challenges in Europe. In fact, you had combatant commanders coming from European Command saying that actually things are going so well in Europe that we could reduce our force presence there, okay? And as AEI has put out in the report that Mackenzie, Tom Donnelly, Gary Schmidt, and I contributed to, put out, is that there are 3 theaters animating our security situation right now: Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, which captures the war on terrorism, but also you have to add in Iran. And we do not have a budget that gets after that problem set, at least the one that we think we'll see tomorrow. Thornberry and McCain are trying to get after that. They're trying to deal with the challenges of tomorrow, or kind of next 5 years, as well as the wars that we're in today. Last point on this. At the beginning of the Obama administration, this just explains why all this stuff needs to be revisited constantly, and the rules of OCO need to constantly be reassessed. Beginning of the Obama administration, remember that Lavrov and Clinton got together and they pressed the reset button. Ironically, they mistranslated the word reset into Russian, which foretold exactly how that reset would actually play out. But fast forward, not even 8 years later, 6 years later, or 7 years later, you had the chairman of Joint Chiefs testifying publicly that the number one threat to U.S. national security was Russia. Not a threat, the number one threat, ahead of all the other threats. And my argument is that we need a budget and we need a security strategy that's properly resourced that takes into account of this new reality. And the fact of the matter is, this budget and the prior budgets did not do that.
I had one footnote on that. We had a nice opportunity a month ago to host General Dunford at Brookings, and I got to ask him, what would be your sixth threat? You know, he's famous for this 4+1 framework: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and then violent extremism, transnational extremism, Islamist extremism, call it what you will. And I asked him what his number 6 threat would be, and I gave him a little time to think. I proposed a few options like rising sea levels, or Pakistan, or mega cities and mega slums of the future, or what have you. And he said fiscal solvency. So he came back to the Mullen line, which doesn't mean that he's against the defense buildup, I don't think, but it does, I think, underscore the importance of thinking more broadly about national power as a fiscal problem as well, and thinking about entitlements, tax reform. Dunford didn't go into this kind of detail, but I just want to take this opportunity to, first of all, reiterate what Dunford said, because the current chairman has now gone on record as echoing the concern of Admiral Mullen a few years ago, when he said that the fiscal situation was, for him, the top threat. I'm not sure I ever agreed with Admiral Mullen fully, but at least he elevated the issue. I think what we need to do now is think about a defense buildup in the context of broader fiscal reform. So the best answer is to break out of the current shackles, break out of the current constraints of the Budget Control Act and OCO, and think about entitlement reform and tax reform. But I just wanted to get that on the table, that Dunford seems to agree with that general set of concerns as well.
Can I add 4 footnotes?
Sure, as long as General Dunford doesn't call me, because what I'm going to start telling the Joint Chiefs is it's time to stay in your lane. Stop talking about fiscal policy. His job is to fund a U.S. military ready to fight and win the nation's wars and keep the peace.
It was my fault.
I'm sick of the chairman, including his predecessor, Mike Mullen, talking about things that aren't their pay grade.
So,
okay, put it out there. I'm just done.
So
Oops, I just got checked.
I'm going to answer the one question you did ask me, which I forgot to answer before, which is, how might you expand OCO? I mean, my view is you keep the same definition for what is genuinely OCO, and you have a separate pot of money in the OCO budget that is not OCO. I mean, it's base, and you say it's base, and you're explicit about it. I mean, that's from a transparency standpoint, that's clearly the best way, I think, of doing it. And I think we've stretched it about as much as we can in terms of a meaningful definition of OCO as something that's military related. So and I don't think that's that hard to do. If one wants to, if we end up with an OCO budget, you can make that segregation in it, right? So I think that would be my answer to that. I think I agree on the I guess another point is I think it's fair to say deficit reduction was done on the back of discretionary spending. I would say equally on defense and non-defense, and there was some mandatory as well. Yeah. So, but clearly not addressing. I mean, I totally agree that the main things we need to address for the long-term financial health, fiscal health of the United States are entitlements and tax increases. I will be explicit. I think we need tax increases, not just tax reform. I do think if you compare with the levels in the CR to adding $54 billion, it's about a 10% increase. So I agree that it's not 10% more than we might likely have gotten if we'd gotten another one of these incremental budget deals we get, and it's not 10% more than what the Obama administration wanted. That it is probably about 3% different there. But compared to today's levels, it is. I mean, or compared to what's in the CR and or the 16 levels, it's about a 10% increase. And I will say, defense is one of the few areas where people often compare it to the plan. What are we doing compared to the plan? At OMB, when I would try to do that with other people at my level who did other parts of the budget, they'd be, what are you talking about? It's all from today's level. So I think
they got to buy into that argument.
Yeah. So I mean, I think we got to be careful about doing the plan aspect of it. And this is all separate from saying how much should. I mean, I'm not addressing how much I think we should be spending on defense. I think there's valid reasons to think we should be spending substantially more on defense. But I'm just saying, from a just trying to get the numbers right. That's my view, at least. The last thing I guess I'd just sort of say as a general comment is I think, if we step back and we're no longer talking about OCO, we're talking about how much do we need to spend on defense and what is the best way to have a sustainable long-term increase in defense. My concern about what appears to be the Trump approach is that it's putting a defense increase on a pretty shaky foundation. I mean, for the long term, because it's essentially moving completely away from the kind of Simpson-Bowles approach, which again included both entitlement reform or cuts, and tax reform or increases. And it is trying to do it entirely, have an increase in defense spending at the same time you're cutting taxes, and frankly, you're probably not going to be able to get those cuts in other areas of the budget that are supposed to pay for those tax increases. If you look at the non-defense discretionary area, which is going to be cut by about $54 billion to pay for the defense part. It's hard to imagine. I mean, about a third of non-defense discretionary is for security. I mean, it's for the VA, it's for international affairs, it's for Homeland Security. Half of the other spending is for the investment spending, education spending, research spending, healthcare spending, for health research and that. I mean, it's just, I'm not sure I see Congress going along with those. I'm not sure Congress should go from a security standpoint, should even go along with those. And then cutting entitlements, we see with the ACA repeal that this is, a lot of people, we can't cut healthcare in DOD, so the notion that it's going to be easy to cut healthcare spending for the rest of the public, I think that's a dubious thinking. So my concern is that I agree we should be spending more on defense. I just think that this approach to spending more on defense is on a very shaky foundation that's not going to get bipartisan support, and there's a good chance it'll lead to growing deficits in the future, and that will come back to haunt federal spending, including defense, just like the Bush tax cuts came back to haunt us over the past 6 years.
Quickly, Roger, before we open it up for questions, Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia said, just like Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, Republican and Democrat, this budget's dead. We don't even have the skinny budget tomorrow, and it's dead because of it's not just $1 for defense, 0 for non-defense, as you've talked about. It's $1 for defense, and we're going to take $1 from non-defense. So where the unofficial gentleman's rule of Washington has been sort of parity for these increases, right? So any budget deal, a la Ryan Murray, to amend the Budget Control Act had parity increases, equal amounts, parts for defense, non-defense. How and where do we go with 2018, and what's the future hold?
Yeah, I think it's perilous for the reasons you've laid out. Ironically, given the subject of this panel, I think OCO is for sure going to be used here, and here's why. It's somewhat ironic. Director Mulvaney, prior to being Director Mulvaney, was Congress Mulvaney, and is actually in that role that he had more power to shape OCO. He failed, but he tried. An amendment he sponsored, it's a distinguished group, Barbara Lee, Chris Van Hollen, Mark Sanford, and Mick Mulvaney put forward an amendment to try to tie down the OCO rules in this more disciplined fashion I think we all would like, provided that the budget picture itself allowed for it on the base side. And he wasn't able to get that amendment passed. As OMB director, he could actually put forward an OCO that applied the rules that his amendment, which tried to put in a statute, but the Congress, ever since 2006, actually always appropriate and also authorizes the OCO and could shift money in there one way or the other. And so if Paul Ryan is given the choice between a CR, threatened shutdown, right, rebellion of the fiscal hawks and the defense hawks, because that's the sandwich that was given from the OMB director, or he could kind of put out that fire, or some of those fires, by saying, you know what, we're just going to throw a bunch of this into the OCO. And Thornberry, McCain, I'll work with you on 19, but for now, will you just pick your number of billions and let me throw into OCO? I'll probably take that deal. And it's ironic because the budget director who came in wanted to prioritize discipline at OCO because they've been so aggressive on the discretionary side and not giving this commensurate increase on non-defensive defense will result, I predict, in an OCO that is less disciplined and larger than they're going to come in with.
My goodness. We're going to open it up quickly for questions. And if you don't get your hand in the air fast, we're going to keep talking among ourselves. So, Tony, over to you first.
Hi, Tony Bertucca. Oh. Hello, Tony Bertucca, Inside Defense. Hello to all of you. My question goes to the FY17 supplemental, which we understand is going to be around $30 billion in OCO. It's been reported by Bloomberg that some of that money would authorize hardware purchases, some F-18s, some F-35s. Let's talk a little bit about the tension for doing that and how bad. I mean, basically you're saying now OCO has jumped the shark and did so long ago. How bad does it jump the shark if you end up with F-35s in the emergency spending account for the FY17 supplemental? And then does that open a door later on when you're trying to put more procurement money into the OCO for 18, 19?
I think you're going to see Super Hornets and JS Joint Strike Fighters in the forthcoming 17 SUP. We can just take it down the line. Whoever wants
Well,
to.
I'd say, I think I'm assuming it will have, I don't know how much hardware it'll have, but clearly if they're adding $30 billion, I mean, it's abundantly clear this is not for military operations, right? That's flat out totally clear, right? So maybe some portion of the $30 billion is, but I would guess a small fraction of it. I mean, I don't know what the number is, but I mean, I think that's just as clear as day. So it will have other things in it, and then the question is, what does it have? And you know, if it's as much as $30 billion, I would not be at all surprised to see it has kind of standard modernization stuff in it. I mean, and it is, you know, it is jumping the shark, I guess, more than we. I mean, it's what we've had so far has been incremental over time, and some of it is, you know, there's stuff that we pay for presence in the region and stuff like that that is probably shouldn't be funded there because it's kind of a permanent presence, but there's a certain logic to it. Once you start just spending stuff that is just in the base budget and there's no pretense that it has anything to do with the region, you know, I think that is different. But the biggest difference is when it goes from being, you know, $5, $10, $15 billion that is for those kinds of things to, you know, adding $30 billion that's potentially for that kind of stuff. You know, that's noticeable, right?
So I'm going to be contrarian here. I'm going to disagree actually with the framework that Steve put forward. Yeah, temporary, extraordinary seems to be the way we approach OCO. I think we need to revisit that. I mean, what is driving? You have to ask the question, what's the rationale for F-18s, F-35s, right? What are the conditions that are making the combatant commanders and those with train and equip authority to say we need more of this? It's not happening in a vacuum. It's not like we just need toys. It's being driven by scenarios that could play out in the Asia theater, particularly China, that they're trying to get ahead of, and particularly in Europe as well. Now, I'm not going to connect the dots between the F-18, F-35, and those theaters, but you can. And I think it's appropriate, for me, the way I think about it, and the way I would like to see OCO organized is, if there is a significant development in international security environment, particularly where deterrence has been degraded and we need to restore that deterrence, which has been a big part of the story outside of the war on terrorism, to me that is, it's pretty extraordinary how quickly Russia's come back on the scene. And we have to ask the question, what are we doing to get after it? Which is why I thought European Reassurance Initiative was an appropriate place, or is appropriate to place ERI in OCO. And I think you can make the same argument with hardware. Last point, on the OCO rules that Congress Mulvaney wanted to put in statute, you have this thing that on hardware, it can only be replacement or repair to original capability, right? So like, if I got the F-16, right, I can only pay, and it was taken out because of all the operations, I can only restore it to another F-16. Even though we're done buying that and we're on to F-35, why does that make any sense? And that was clearly what he was trying to get after there. Now, there have been times where OMB, I understand, got that. And like, okay, well, we're not going to go ahead and reinvest in a fourth-generation warfighter, how many millions of dollars that is, while we're buying fifth-generation fighters. I think that's the type of kind of common sense approach that we should allow to go through, that Director Mulvaney pushed back against, that I think we ought to cut through. And if Congress can say anything in the matter, they should support it. And they do every year when they authorize and appropriate an F-18 and F-35 on these things.
So can I respond to that? So I mean, I don't know that we actually disagree. I'm not saying that I'm not saying I'm not saying that new challenges aren't developing and that we need to be able to respond to them, but they've always developed over time. I mean, and we've developed, and to the extent that they are not for actually ongoing military operations, I don't think it's not the traditional notion of OCO. I think there's a value to having a separate, segregated chunk of money that is for military operations when we actually go to war. And it's fuzzy, and I will be the first to admit there's gray areas here about what to include and what not to include. And the example you gave is an example of a gray area. There's also gray areas where we buy specialized equipment that we're going to be having the force structure for 30 years that we buy through OCO, even though it's going to only be in OCO for a few years and then it'll be in a regular force structure. So it cuts both ways. I mean, and you can't, and it's hard to do it in the right way. But I guess my point is that I do think there's a value in having a separate pot of money that is currently called OCO, used to be called GWAT, that is pretty much for if we go to war. Now we're in a situation, and so I would not put into that things that are responding to long-term challenges like China. We need, the reason we're doing it isn't because we would, if we want to respond to China, we should put that in our base budget. To me, that's a long-term kind of threat. The reason we're talking about putting it in OCO is not because I think any of us think, no, it should really go into OCO and we should redefine what's in OCO. it's because, well, we can't get into the base budget, so let's put it in OCO. So I wouldn't expand it to go beyond military operations. If you're gonna, as a political expedient or whatever, you have to put it in OCO because you can't get it in base, then don't try to pretend it's war related. I mean, have it a separate chunk of money and just be clear about it. I mean, from transparency point of view, I think that's the right approach.
Quick rejoinder. But what I'm trying to get at, there's a spectrum here between peacetime, kind of just what we're doing on the normal train equip side, and full on contingency operation at war. What about freedom of navigation operations? That as just burning a hole through operations maintenance. What about the Libya operations, right? Where that came out of the base budget, but that's clearly you're not contemplated and full on operations. What about what we're doing right now to try to deter Russia in some sort of NATO-Baltic scenario, where we really need to get things in there fast, both in terms of force presence posture and capability? So those are all things that I don't think are kind of peacetime, you could argue belong squarely in the base budget. There's a rationale to say along the spectrum, close to full-on military operation or contingency, it belongs kind of in that direction. And I think OCO could be utilized there.
Yeah, I'll just add, and then I will stop.
Rejoin
thing is, I think there is an area like that, but that to me gets to the gray area point, and we're talking about a few $1 billion. I mean, Libya was about a $1 billion operation, something like that. I mean, it's in the context of the defense budget we have, that's something I think is manageable. But I mean, and we've managed those kinds of, that's how we did things in the past, right? So I agree there's gray areas, and I think some Russian reassurance kind of stuff makes sense in OCO. I'm not saying there's nothing related to an ongoing kind of, if we have to have a rapid deployment someplace that, that's outside of the Iraq and Afghanistan theaters or whatever, that wouldn't make sense to put it in OCO. I'm just saying, to me, that's not the fundamental pressure thing. When we're talking about adding $30 billion to OCO, potentially above what's really needed for military operations, we're not talking about, I don't think we're talking about those examples. I mean, there are gray areas, and there will always be gray areas, but they're not of that magnitude, I don't think.
Look what you started, Tony. All right, we'll take two back to back here, and then back there, and then we'll get you third. So come here. We're going to take two questions at the same time. No, we're going to take this question and that question at the same time.
Share the mic.
Yes.
Thanks. If I could just piggyback on the 17 budget, you just assumed that the SUP's going to pass for $30 billion. Could you walk through the rest of the 17 budget and the supplemental and see how the process is going to work?
Sure. Sir, go ahead.
Mackenzie, this would broaden the aperture, and if you don't want to go there, wave us off. But I mean, all of these pretzel-bending yoga moves that these fine scholars are talking about are a function of the ACA, or rather the BCA, the other one, the BCA, and that goes back to
Obamacare. It's all Obamacare.
That's it, exactly. I knew you'd say that, Roger. That's because 6 years ago, everybody thought that the grand deal could be done. They were wrong, but the assumption was good. So they created this suicide bomb as an incentive. Well, it didn't happen. And so we're caught with some of the smartest people I've done business with going through these ridiculous machinations about how you pay obvious requirements. We all live, everybody in this room lives in the defense rabbit hole, and we have our heads down. But, there's a broader political environment in which this is going to get solved, or not. Do any of you, and Mackenzie, if you wish to, please jump in as well. Do any of you see a likelihood in any time horizon that matters, where we might tiptoe up to the possibility of another grand deal so that smart people like you aren't tied up doing crap like this?
Okay, we're gonna start with Michael. I'll just say, fair point on the 30 billion SUP. Paul Ryan said that's what I have the votes for, and I think there's a plurality of Congress who will support it with strong backing of the Secretary of Defense.
So Pat, I'll leave the fiscal 17 supplemental to others, but on your broad issue, I'm not going to try to propose what should be in that conversation in detail, of course, but I do think that it's a valid point, and it may not happen this year. It may not be the thing we get to right away. It probably is what we should be debating as we get into 2018 and 2020 election season. And I'll just put one specific idea on the table that I've been starting to try to think through, which is instead of breaking down the discretionary budget, so-called discretionary budget, into defense and domestic, which of course is already a mistake because as Steve pointed out and others, a lot of the quote-unquote domestic accounts are for national security related purposes. Maybe we need to create a third way of thinking about it, a third category, or break the non-defense part into two bins. This isn't going to make it easy to cut those funds, and I'm not advocating that we cut them, but it may help the politics. And what I would suggest is that non-defense discretionary be redefined partly in a national security subcategory, which would include everything like the Coast Guard, DHS in general, Department of State, foreign assistance programs, and also probably science investment, science R&D, even non-defense science, and infrastructure to make America great again. Because without good infrastructure, we can't get our military reinforcements to port. For one thing, the cyber systems that run those are going to be attacked if we ever wind up in a major power fight. And so our inability to keep the Port of Los Angeles running because the Russians have hacked the computers there is actually going to be what impedes us from reinforcing more than any kind of issue about traditionally defined military readiness, I would predict. So maybe we need a subcategory that is sort of national security related non-defense. I'm sorry, I don't have a better, pithier term. And then we can have sort of, enriching American life, stuff I believe in, the president may not, but everything from PBS to the National Endowment for the Humanities to certain forms of college financing that are unrelated to science. And so you would have a sort of true domestic bin within that non-defense category. And then maybe we can treat the three categories somewhat differently from each other in terms of how their future budget trajectories go. I'm not suggesting we cut the humanities stuff to pay for everything else. The White House might favor that, I don't. But at least we could correct the debate and help people understand that domestic, quote unquote, pot of money that we're talking about now really serves a lot of national security purposes, and we can't be quite so frivolous about how we target it.
We're going to end on time, so answer the question or last word.
So I would, if we could get $45 billion from cutting humanities programs, I'd be all for it. But one is I don't know whether it'll pass or not. I wasn't really trying to suggest that. I think it's a lot easier than getting a $54 billion increase when you're also asking for a $54 billion cut in non-defense. So I think it's easier, and so I wouldn't be surprised if it passes, but I don't know. In terms of the grand bargain, since tax increases are part of the grand bargain, very hard to see that happening for a few years, at least, until things change, the political circumstances change. I do think ultimately, and maybe it's 2-4 years down the road, I think it's possible. I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you look at CBO projections of the deficit and stuff like that, long-term projections, we're not that, if you're actually willing to make political commitments to cut entitlements in certain areas and raise taxes, we're not that far apart from having a pretty good fiscal situation down the road. So I think the grand bargain still makes a lot of sense. Politically, it's hard to see that happening anytime soon.
Roger, last word.
20 seconds. Okay. On the security idea that you put forward, when the BCA first deal came out, they actually had a security category, which included defense, some things you talked about. The outcome was that defense didn't get as much as we were all hoping. So I'm kind of aware of that. Grand bargain, Paul Ryan would love to do that. That's what he ran on. That's what he became speaker talking about it. Donald Trump, I think, was elected actually avoiding talking about doing entitlement reform. And so I think you need a White House to get a grand bargain, and I don't think this White House wants to get after those things. Last point, part of that $30 billion, some of the money is going to go to a wall. That will incent some Republicans, incense others. But in the end, I've never seen an appropriations bill get stuck because of a SUP, right? The House just already passed the FY17 appropriation standalone with a lot of Democratic support, which means that they'll probably get the same type of support in the Senate. And if they tack on quote-unquote war spending, despite the fact that maybe half of it's not classically war, I'm not going to see anybody stop that supplemental going through. So I think FY17 for the defense appropriations and SUP will get through.
Well, this panel certainly did not disappoint in liveliness and candor and strong opinions. So anyway, thanks guys so much for showing up this morning, and thanks to all of you.